That's not your real name anyway, is it, Emma? My uncle's words, slurred with just enough wine to be deniable, sliced through the cheerful dinner chatter like a shard of glass. I froze, my fork hovering halfway to my mouth, a bite of perfectly roasted chicken suddenly forgotten. The lively hum of conversation, my Aunt Carol talking about her garden, my father, David, holding court about interest rates, died in an instant. It was as if a vacuum had sucked all the sound and air from the room. Across the gleaming mahogany table, my fiancé Mark's fork clattered against his plate, a percussive, shocking sound in the sudden, suffocating silence. My mother, Susan, whose entire existence was a carefully composed mask of pleasantries and social grace, went completely, terrifyingly blank. Her face, usually a warm hostess glow, drained of all colour, leaving a pasty, slack-jawed void. My father's jaw clenched so hard. A muscle jumped violently in his cheek, his knuckles bone-white around the handle of his steak knife. They exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated panic, a frantic, silent conversation I had witnessed my entire life but never, ever understood. It was the look they shared when a state trooper was behind them on the highway, the look they shared when a teenage Leo had crashed his first car. It was a look of imminent disaster. For as long as I could remember, I had felt like a stranger in my own family, a puzzle piece from a different box, always trying to jam myself into a space I didn't quite fit. And my brother, Leo, the golden child, the reason for this celebratory dinner, just smirked into his napkin, a flicker of cruel amusement in his eyes. In that single, deafening moment of silence, punctuated only by my uncle's heavy, drunken breathing, I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that my entire life was a lie. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. The immediate aftermath was a masterclass in my family's special brand of psychological warfare, a well-rehearsed play they had performed countless times. My mother, recovering first with the speed of a seasoned actress, let out a brittle, unconvincing laugh that shattered the tense silence. "Oh, Rick, you've had far too much to drink," she said, waving a dismissive, jeweled hand in his direction. "Emma, darling, he's just being ridiculous. Pay him no mind. You know how he gets after a second glass of red." She turned to the rest of the table, her smile a desperate, painted, on grimace. "More wine, anyone?" My father chimed in, his voice a low growl of pure menace, aimed squarely at his brother-in-law. "That's enough, Rick. You're making a fool of yourself." Apologized to Emma. It was their classic one, two-punch, dismiss and attack, the gaslighter and the enforcer. For 28 years, this exact strategy had worked every single time. They would create a narrative of my oversensitivity or someone else's foolishness, and I, desperate to keep the fragile peace, would accept it. I would be the bigger person, the mature one, the one who smoothed things over. But not this time. The terror in their eyes had been too real, too raw. "What did you mean by that, Uncle Rick?" I asked, my voice shockingly steady, cutting through their frantic attempts to paper over the crack that had just split our lives wide open. Rick, a large, usually jovial man, seemed to sober up instantly under the weight of my direct question and the venomous, warning glare from my father. He blanched, shaking his head and mumbling into his wine glass. "Nothing, kid. Just a stupid joke." "Forget it." Mark squeezed my hand under the table, a silent, firm signal of support that anchored me in the swirling chaos. He saw it too. This was no joke. My parents, seeing that their usual tactics were failing, that I wouldn't let it go, resorted to their final, desperate measure, scorched earth. My mother suddenly clutched her head, a pained expression on her face. "Oh my goodness, this migraine has come on so suddenly," she moaned. My father stood abruptly, throwing his napkin on the table. "That's it, the evening's over. Susan isn't well." They practically fled their own dinner party, leaving a bewildered Aunt Carol, a still smirking Leo, and a suddenly very sober and terrified-looking uncle in their wake. The car ride home with Mark was thick with unspoken words. The air crackled with the enormity of what had just happened. "They're not just mad, Em," Mark finally said as we pulled into our driveway, his voice gentle but firm. They weren't just embarrassed. They were absolutely terrified. And that's when I knew, with chilling certainty, that I couldn't go back to being the girl who kept the peace. I had to burn it all down to find the truth. To understand the sheer animal terror in my parents' eyes, you have to understand the foundation of our family, which was less like bedrock and more like a carefully balanced pile of rubble held together by my compliance. I was the designated adult, a role I was assigned so early I can't remember ever just being a child. My first memory is of packing my own lunch for kindergarten because my mother was too overwhelmed dealing with a toddler-aged Leo. I was so mature for her age, a compliment that I later realized was just a way of celebrating my own parentification. I was the reliable one, the responsible one, the one who never caused trouble. My brother, Leo, 2 years my junior, was the designated golden child, the sun around which our family-themed solar system chaotically revolved. My achievements were met with a polite, distracted nod. His were grounds for a city-wide parade. When I graduated from state college with honors, after working 2 part-time jobs to minimize my student loans, my graduation was marked with a card that contained a $20 bill and a pre-printed note saying they were so proud. When Leo decided, at 26, to become a lifestyle influencer, a venture my parents funded with a brand new SUV for his location shoots and a chic downtown apartment for his creative space, they spoke of his brave entrepreneurial spirit as if he'd just cured polio. This dynamic was most obvious and most painful when it came to money. I was, for all intents and purposes, the family emergency fund. The calls would always start the same way, with my mother's syrupy sweet voice. "Emma, sweetie, we have a little situation." That little situation was always a euphemism for Leo has screwed up again and we are enabling him. Once, they called in a panic, needing $3,000 for a leaky roof. I drained my savings, picturing water pouring into their living room, feeling a pang of guilt that I hadn't been able to give more. A week later, I saw pictures on Leo's Instagram of a spontaneous networking trip to Bali, tagged with "blessed." When I confronted them, my voice shaking with a sense of betrayal, my father turned it on me. "You're being selfish, Emma," he'd said, his voice cold. "A family is a team. We support each other. You always have to make things so transactional." It was a demolition derby, and I was the designated driver, expected to ferry everyone to safety while they gleefully crashed around me. They had built an entire system where I existed to absorb their problems, to be the steady, responsible rock they could always chip away at, and my one unspoken job was to never ever question it. Meeting Mark was like having someone turn on all the lights in a dark, cluttered room I hadn't even realized I was stumbling through. For years I had navigated my family's toxic, fog-filled dynamics alone, assuming this was just how all families were. I had internalized their narrative so completely that I truly believed I was difficult and dramatic whenever I tried to set even the smallest boundary. Mark came from a normal, loving, shockingly functional family where support wasn't transactional and love wasn't a weapon used to ensure compliance. The first time he came to a family dinner, it was like watching an anthropologist calmly study a newly discovered and highly dysfunctional tribe. He was polite and charming, but I could see him quietly cataloguing every backhanded compliment, every subtle jab aimed in my direction, every time Leo interrupted me to talk about himself. My mother, in her element, tried to bring him into her confidence, to recruit him to her side of the invisible war. "Emma has always been so intense," she confided in him with a theatrical sigh while I was in the kitchen getting dessert. "We've always had to walk on eggshells around her. She feels things so deeply it can be draining." I walked back into the room just in time to hear Mark's calm, unwavering reply. "Really? That's funny. From what I've seen, she's the most resilient and level-headed person here. It seems like she's the one doing all the emotional heavy lifting." My mother's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a tiny glitch in the matrix. No one had ever contradicted her before, especially not an outsider in her own house. He never made a big deal out of it in front of them, but in private, he consistently and quietly validated my reality. One evening, after a particularly manipulative phone call from my father about needing to borrow money for a dental emergency that I suspected was actually for Leo's car payment, I hung up feeling twisted with guilt. Mark just looked at me and said, "You know you don't have to set yourself on fire to keep them warm, right?" It was a simple question, but it struck me with the force of a physical blow. He was the first person who didn't see my strength as a resource to be exploited, but as something to be cherished and protected. His presence gave me the courage to begin questioning the foundational myths of my life. He was my anchor in a sea of gaslighting, and without him, I would have been swept away by their denials after that fateful dinner. He helped me see it wasn't a joke, it was a confession. The night after the disastrous dinner party was a long, sleepless torment. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the raw, primal panic on my parents' faces, a look that went far beyond mere social embarrassment. Mark's words echoed in my head on a loop. They were terrified. The next morning, I woke up with a cold, hard knot of certainty in my stomach. I couldn't let this go. I couldn't be the good, quiet girl anymore. My first move was to try the most direct route. I called Uncle Rick. Unsurprisingly, his phone went straight to voicemail. "Hey Rick, it's Emma. Your phone must be off. Give me a call when you get this." I left 3 more messages over the course of the day, each more urgent than the last. No reply. I tried my Aunt Carol, but her phone also went unanswered, which was unusual for her. It was a classic family maneuver, total lockdown. They were circling the wagons, and I was clearly on the outside. My father even sent me a curt, dismissive text. "Your uncle is deeply ashamed of his behavior and needs some space. We'd all appreciate it if you would drop this and stop causing more drama." The word drama was their go-to weapon. The label they slapped on any legitimate, emotional response I had to their dysfunction. It only strengthened my resolve. If they were hiding something this desperately, it had to be significant. My mind immediately went to the one place where secrets are kept, the dusty archive of our family's official, highly edited history, my father's study. Specifically, the heavy, fireproof file box tucked away in the bottom drawer of his imposing mahogany desk. It was the family sanctum, a place I was never, ever allowed to touch as a child. It held all the important documents, deeds, wills, insurance policies, and birth certificates. I had never had a reason or the courage to look inside before, but now it felt like the key to everything. The plan formed in my mind with a cold sense of purpose that surprised me. I would wait until they went out for their regular Friday morning golf game with the Hendersons. I knew I had a 4-hour window. The thought of going through their private things, of violating their trust, filled me with a lifetime's worth of conditioned guilt. But the need to know the truth was a primal, burning thing that was far stronger. I felt like a spy in my own childhood home, a traitor to the family I was beginning to suspect had betrayed me first, long ago. The mystery of my uncle's words had ignited a fire in me, and I was ready to search through the ashes of my past to find out what they were so terrified of me learning. That Friday felt like the longest day of my life. I sat in my car, parked a block away from my childhood home, my heart hammering against my ribs. I watched the clock on my dashboard, the minutes ticking by with agonizing slowness. Finally, at precisely 9:05 a.m., the garage door rolled up and their Lexus sedan backed out of the driveway. I saw my father, dressed in his golf polo, and my mother in the passenger seat, her face still a mask of strained pleasantry. The moment their car turned the corner and disappeared from view, I moved. The house fell silent the moment I stepped inside, using the spare key I still had. It was a silence I'd never experienced there before, a silence that felt heavy with unspoken words and buried history. My father's study smelled the way it always had, of old books, leather, and a faint cloying scent of cherry pipe tobacco he hadn't smoked in years. It was a scent I'd always associated with authority, secrets, and a vague sense of unease. I went straight to the desk and pulled open the bottom drawer. The file box was heavy, a dead weight of untold stories. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. It was meticulously organized, with neatly labeled folders for everything, a testament to my mother's obsession with control and order. Deeds, insurance, wills, Leo. I pulled out Leo's folder first. Inside, right on top, was his birth certificate, a crisp official document detailing his birth at St. Jude's Hospital. I searched for mine. There was a folder with Emma, written on it in my mother's perfect, looping cursive, but it was thinner than Leo's, much thinner. Inside, I found my old report cards, a few swimming competition medals from middle school, my immunization records, even a lock of my baby hair in a tiny envelope, but no birth certificate. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just misplaced, it simply wasn't there. I started to dig deeper, my initial methodical search devolving into a frantic, desperate rummage. I pulled out every folder, every piece of paper, my panic growing with each empty-handed search. At the very bottom of the box, beneath everything else, tucked under the metal railing, my fingers brushed against a small plastic-wrapped object. I pulled it out. It was a hospital bracelet, the plastic yellowed and brittle with age. I could clearly read the typed name of the hospital, the same one Leo was born in, and my mother's name, Susan Miller. But the date of birth printed on it was from 1993, 3 full years before I was supposedly born. My heart stopped. Then I saw the tiny separate tag for the baby attached to the main band with a small plastic loop. The last name was Miller. The first name was Sarah. The plastic of the hospital bracelet felt both flimsy and monumental in my hand. Sarah. The name meant nothing to me. Yet it felt like a key turning in a lock I never knew existed. I sat on the floor of my father's study for what felt like an hour, just staring at it. My mind raced, trying to fit this impossible piece into the puzzle of my life. A secret baby, a sibling who died. But why the extreme secrecy? Why the sheer terror when my uncle misspoke my name? I carefully placed the bracelet in a small, empty ring box from my purse, a makeshift reliquary for a ghost. Then I drove to my parents' house, the box sitting on the passenger seat like a tiny ticking bomb. I didn't call ahead. I let myself in with my key and found them in the living room, watching television, a perfect portrait of suburban normalcy. They were acting as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't fled their own home in a panic just a few nights prior. They looked up, startled by my sudden entrance. My mother's face immediately arranged itself into a look of strained warmth. "Emma, sweetie, what a surprise. You should have called." I didn't let her finish her performance. I walked to the marble coffee table and placed the tiny ring box in the center, snapping open the lid. The yellowed hospital bracelet lay starkly against the black velvet. "I found this in your file box," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I was looking for my birth certificate, which seems to be missing. Can you tell me who Sarah is?" The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The pleasant masks didn't just slip, they shattered. My father stood up, his face darkening with a rage I knew was born from fear. "What in the hell were you doing going through our private things? After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? By snooping around our home like a common thief?" It was a textbook deflection, a desperate, clumsy attempt to make me the villain of the story. My mother, on cue, started to cry, her voice catching with practiced fragility. "Oh, Emma, you don't understand," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. It was from a miscarriage we had. A little girl we lost before you were born. We named her Sarah." It was too painful to ever talk about. The story was plausible, beautifully delivered with a trembling lip and tear-filled eyes. But it felt wrong. It felt rehearsed. The pieces didn't fit the sheer terror I had witnessed. A painful memory wouldn't cause that reaction. A dangerous, life-altering secret would. They were trying to use my empathy against me, to drown my questions in a flood of their supposed grief. I didn't buy it for a second. "A miscarriage?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Then why did Uncle Rick say my name wasn't Emma?" The confrontation ended in a predictable, toxic stalemate of my father's rage and my mother's tears. They clung to the miscarriage story like a life raft, refusing to be moved from it. My father called me ungrateful and disrespectful, his voice booming through the house. My mother sobbed that I was dredging up the most painful moment of their lives for no reason, accusing me of being cruel and insensitive. It was a masterful performance, a united front of manufactured victimhood designed to make me feel so guilty that I would retreat, apologize, and restore the status quo. I left their house not with clarity, but with a thicker, more confusing fog of deception and a gut feeling that they were lying through their teeth. The miscarriage story was a shield, a hastily constructed wall to hide whatever truth lay behind it, and I knew I had to find a way to get past it. That night, Mark and I sat at our kitchen table until the early hours of the morning, the tiny, yellowed bracelet lying between us like a sacred relic. "It doesn't make sense," I said, for what felt like the 100th time, tracing the letters of the name Sarah with my finger. If it was a miscarriage, why hide the bracelet at the very bottom of the box? Why wouldn't my birth certificate be in there? Why would Rick connect this secret baby to my name? Why would he say, "That's not your real name anyway"? The phrasing is what gets me. Mark, ever the pragmatist, opened his laptop, the screen casting a pale blue light on his serious face. "Okay, let's assume they're lying," he said, his fingers poised over the keyboard. "Let's work with the facts we have. A baby named Sarah Miller, born on this date, at this hospital. If she was born, there has to be a record of it somewhere." We spent the next several hours diving deep into the rabbit hole of online public records. We searched state birth and death databases, county archives, and even old newspaper announcement records for a Sarah Miller born on that specific date. We found nothing. It was like she was a ghost. No birth certificate, no death certificate, no public notice of any kind. We expanded the search, trying different spellings, looking for any infant deaths around that time that might correspond with a secret family tragedy. The result was always the same: a digital dead end. It was as if the baby on that hospital bracelet had never officially existed. "This is more than just a family secret," Mark finally said, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his tired eyes. "This is a cover-up. It's like they intentionally erased her from all official records, and the question is why? What kind of secret is so terrible you have to scrub a child's entire existence from public view?" The thought was chilling. My search for my identity was leading me down a path that felt increasingly dark and dangerous, and I began to wonder what kind of crime would necessitate erasing a child's existence so completely. With my parents in total lockdown and the official records yielding nothing, I felt like I was hitting a wall of carefully constructed silence. Every avenue was a dead end. I was beginning to feel the familiar pull of giving up, of just letting it go to keep the peace, a reflex conditioned into me since childhood. But the image of my mother's terrified face was burned into my mind. I knew I was close to something important. There was only one other person who had been in the house my entire life. One person who might have seen or heard something, even if he didn't understand its significance at the time. My brother, Leo. Our relationship had always been a complicated dance of my deep-seated resentment and our shared history. He was the pampered prince, and I was the court jester, expected to applaud his every mediocre achievement, but we had grown up together. There had to be some sliver of loyalty there, buried beneath years of blatant parental favoritism. I decided to take a chance. I texted him, keeping my tone light and casual. "Hey, free for coffee this week? Feels like it's been a while." He agreed, surprisingly quickly, suggesting a trendy, overpriced cafe downtown where he could be seen. We met the next day. He was his usual self-absorbed self, spending the first 20 minutes talking about his latest brand collaboration for a questionable men's grooming product and the ongoing struggles of getting good lighting for his posts. I let him talk, nodding and feigning interest, waiting for an opening. Finally, I cut in. "Leo, I need to ask you about the other night at dinner." He immediately became defensive, his easy charm evaporating. "Look, Em, Uncle Rick was drunk. You're blowing this whole thing way out of proportion. Mom and Dad are really upset. You should just leave it alone." He was reciting the family script, word for word. But I pushed back, leaning forward. "They're lying to me, Leo. I know they are. I found something." I lowered my voice, making him lean in to hear me. "I found a hospital bracelet in Dad's file box. For a baby girl named Sarah, born 3 years before me." I watched his face closely, looking for any crack in his composure, and I saw it. For a fleeting moment, his smug confidence vanished. He couldn't quite meet my eyes, and his hand, the one holding his ridiculously small espresso cup, trembled slightly. It wasn't a look of surprise, it was a look of deep, uncomfortable recognition. He knew the name. "I don't know what you're talking about," he mumbled, but his voice lacked all conviction. He knew something. He had always been the primary beneficiary of the family secrets, so it made perfect sense that he would also be a keeper of them. I left the cafe feeling more certain than ever. Leo was the weak link in the chain. He wasn't going to confess anything to me, but I had rattled him. and rattled people make mistakes. For a few agonizing days, there was nothing but a profound and unnerving silence. The wall my family had erected seemed impenetrable. My text to Leo went unanswered. My calls to my parents' house were met with the disconnected tone of a blocked number. I was officially in exile. I was beginning to lose hope, a cold dread seeping into me as I wondered if I would ever find out the truth, if I was doomed to live my life with this gaping hole in the middle of my identity. Then, one evening, as I was mindlessly scrolling through my phone, it buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart leaped into my throat. "This is Carol," it read. Carol. My aunt, Uncle Rick's wife. In all my 28 years, I'd barely had a one-on-one conversation with her. She was the quiet, mousy woman who always stood a few feet behind my boisterous uncle, nodding and smiling but rarely speaking. At family functions, she was perpetually overshadowed by my mother's commanding presence and my father's bluster, fading into the floral wallpaper of our family's drama. The text continued, each word making my pulse quicken. "Rick feels terrible about what happened. He is beside himself with guilt. He wants to talk to you, but your parents are watching him like a hawk. He can't use his phone. They've told everyone he's gone on a fishing trip to Canada." The fishing trip. A classic, almost laughably transparent lie. He was being held a virtual prisoner in his own home, isolated to ensure his silence. My family was so desperate to keep their secret that they were willing to quarantine one of their own. This was a new level of control, a new depth of manipulation, and it was utterly terrifying. "He wants to tell you everything." The next text read, "He says it's gone on long enough, and that you deserve the truth." My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely type my reply. "Yes, when and where?" She named a small, run-down diner in a town 30 miles away, a place none of us would ever frequent, a place where we would never be seen. This was it. A crack in the wall, appearing from the most unexpected quarter. My aunt, the silent observer, the woman I had always dismissed as a non-entity, had decided to take a stand. It was a huge, monumental risk for her. Defying my parents was social and familial suicide in our clan. But her loyalty to her tormented husband, and perhaps a long-buried sense of justice, had finally pushed her to act. She was my unexpected ally, the one person I never would have counted on, and she was about to blow the entire conspiracy wide open. The diner was exactly the kind of place you'd go to share secrets. It was called the Corner Booth, and it was stuck in a time warp from the 1970s. The vinyl on the booth seats was cracked and repaired with strips of silver duct tape, and the air smelled of stale coffee, grease, and decades of whispered conversations. It was perfect. My Aunt Carol sat in a corner booth, just as the restaurant's name promised, nervously shredding a paper napkin into a snowy pile on the table. My Uncle Rick sat beside her, looking 10 years older, and infinitely more haggard than he had just a week ago. The boisterous, wine-fueled man from the dinner party was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he was being crushed by the weight of the world. His eyes were bloodshot, and his shoulders were slumped in defeat. He looked up as I approached the table, and his eyes, when they met mine, were filled with a heartbreaking mixture of fear and profound relief. "Emma," he began, his voice raspy and low, as if it hadn't been used in days. "I am so sorry. For everything." I slid into the booth opposite them, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The moment was finally here. I pushed aside the anger, the hurt, the confusion. All I wanted was the truth. "Just tell me, Uncle Rick," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Tell me all of it." He took a deep, shaky breath, glancing at his wife, who reached across the table and placed her hand over his. She gave him a firm, encouraging nod. He turned back to me, his gaze direct and filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to have no bottom. "Your parents are lying to you," he said, the words coming out in a rush, as if he was afraid they'd get stuck if he paused. "There was no miscarriage. Sarah was a real baby. She lived. And she didn't die." He paused, letting the words sink in, watching my face. I could only stare, speechless. "The baby on that hospital bracelet. The little girl named Sarah." He took another ragged breath. "That was you, Emma. Your name was Sarah. The words hung in the stale, greasy air of the diner, thick and unbelievable. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. Me? I was Sarah? It didn't make sense. It couldn't be true. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Mom is my mother. Susan is my mother." Rick shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with tears. "No, kid. No, she's not. Susan is your aunt. She raised you, yes. God help her, she raised you. But she didn't give birth to you. Your real mother, your birth mother, was Amelia. Amelia, my mother's younger sister. The ghost. The one they never, ever talked about. The one whose picture wasn't in any of the family albums." The official story, told to me once in hushed tones when I was a teenager, was that she had been a troubled soul who had run off with a bad crowd and died in a tragic car accident when I was just a baby. It was another one of their clean, simple, devastatingly effective stories designed to hide a messy, unforgivable truth. My entire identity, the name I answered to, the parents I called my own, the very story of my existence, it was all a lie they had all been keeping for 28 years. I stared at my uncle, my mind struggling to connect the disparate, shocking pieces of information. My mother. Was Aunt Amelia? I whispered, the name feeling utterly foreign on my tongue, like a word from a language I didn't speak. He nodded grimly, the pain of this decades-old confession etched on his face. Amelia was. She was everything the rest of our family wasn't, he began, a flicker of fond memory in his sad eyes. She was the wild child, the free spirit, a brilliant artist. She painted and wrote poetry and fell in love with everyone and everything. Our family, especially your grandparents, Susan and Amelia's parents, they couldn't stand it. They are all about appearances, control, a perfect public image. Amelia was a constant source of shame for them. He painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture of a frightened, defiant young woman being systematically ostracized by her own family. When Amelia got pregnant at 19, she wasn't married. She refused to name the father, said it was her business and no one else's. For your grandparents, it was the ultimate, unforgivable scandal. They tried to force her to give the baby up for adoption, quietly, but she refused. She was going to keep you no matter what. He told me how she had her baby, the baby she named Sarah, mostly alone, with only him and Carol for support. The complications, they weren't from a car crash, Rick continued, his voice cracking with emotion. There were complications after the birth, a postpartum infection. The doctors at the hospital said it was serious but treatable, that she just needed to stay for a course of IV antibiotics. But your grandparents, they intervened. They insisted on bringing her home. They were trying to figure out how to handle the situation without any more public scandal. They delayed. They thought they knew better than the doctors. His voice dropped to a choked whisper. By the time they finally agreed to take her back to the hospital, it was too late. The infection had become septic. She died. The casual, calculated cruelty of it stole my breath. They had let their own daughter die. They had watched her get sicker and sicker, all because they were worried about what the neighbors might think. And me? I asked, my voice numb. What happened to me, the baby? That, he explained, was where my so-called parents, Susan and David, entered the picture. They had been trying for years to have a child, going through rounds of fertility treatments without any success. My grandparents, in their grief and monstrous pragmatism, saw an opportunity. They could erase their shameful problem, the illegitimate baby of their dead, rebellious daughter, and give their favored, compliant daughter the child she so desperately wanted. It was a neat, tidy, monstrously evil solution. They orchestrated the entire thing. They moved towns shortly after, hired expensive lawyers to create a new identity for me, falsified a birth certificate, and told the world that Amelia had died tragically and childless in an accident. They erased her memory and her daughter in one fell swoop, replacing Sarah, daughter of the outcast Amelia, with Emma, the perfect, legitimate daughter of the perfect, respectable couple, Susan and David. The sheer, diabolical scale of the deception was staggering, but one question still burned in my mind, a question that cut through the shock and grief. Why? I asked, my voice shaking with a cold, hard rage that was starting to build beneath the surface. Why all of this? Why not just say I was adopted? Why the insane, elaborate, 28-year-long lie? Why did they have to erase her completely? Uncle Rick exchanged a dark, pained look with Aunt Carol. This was clearly the part he dreaded telling me the most, the ugly, rotten core of the entire conspiracy. "Money, Emma," he said quietly, his voice heavy with shame. In the end, it was always about the money. He then explained something that shattered the last remaining vestiges of my old reality. My maternal grandparents, the cold, calculating architects of this whole monstrous affair, were incredibly wealthy. They had built a plastics manufacturing empire from the ground up and had set up massive, ironclad trust funds for each of their future grandchildren. But the trusts came with a complex web of conditions, including a strict, archaic morality clause. It was a document straight out of the 19th century, designed to control their descendants from beyond the grave. It was your grandfather's obsession, Rick explained. This idea of a perfect, untarnished family line. Any heir born out of wedlock, or whose parents engaged in behavior deemed scandalous or immoral, would be completely and irrevocably disinherited. My existence as Sarah, the illegitimate daughter of the family disgrace, Amelia, meant I would receive nothing. Worse, my very presence, if acknowledged, could have jeopardized my mother's Susan Sohn inheritance as well, as she would be seen as connected to the scandal by association. By creating Emma, the legitimate biological daughter of the upstanding Susan and David Miller, they bypassed the morality clause entirely. They weren't just giving their favored daughter the child she desperately wanted, they were securing my access to the massive family fortune. My entire life had not been an act of love or rescue, but a cold, calculated, long-term financial investment. I wasn't a daughter, I was an asset. The care, the upbringing, the love it, was all a means to an end. The reason they favored Leo, the reason I was always the one who had to be responsible, frugal, and self-sufficient, was suddenly crystal clear. Leo was their son, their blood. I was their retirement plan, their golden goose, and they were just waiting for my inheritance to mature so they could pluck the feathers. The drive home from the diner was a complete blur. I was sitting in the passenger seat next to Mark, who had insisted on driving me to the meeting and had waited patiently in the car, but I felt like I was in a different dimension, watching my own life play out on a distant, silent screen. The woman I had called Mom my entire life was my aunt, a kidnapper of my identity. The man I called Dad was my uncle, her accomplice. The woman who had actually given birth to me, Amelia, had been murdered through negligence and then systematically erased from history, her memory sacrificed for the sake of propriety and greed. Every family photo, every birthday party, every Christmas morning was now tainted, reframed as a scene in a meticulously crafted play, a performance for an audience that didn't exist. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, that it felt physical, like a hollow, aching void in the center of my chest. When we finally got home, I walked through the front door and stood in the middle of our living room, and then I finally, completely broke down. The shock gave way to a tidal wave of grief and rage that was primal and terrifying. I grieved for the mother I never knew, the vibrant, artistic woman whose name was a forbidden word in our house. I grieved for the little girl named Sarah, who was stolen, renamed, and raised by her mother's betrayers. And then came the rage, a white-hot, cleansing fire. It was a rage for the people who did it. The people I had called parents. They hadn't just lied to me. They had used me as a financial instrument. My entire sense of self, every memory, every feeling, was built on the foundation of their fraud. Mark just held me. He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy answers. He didn't tell me it would be okay. He just let me scream and cry and rage, absorbing the torrent of my pain and validating every ounce of it. "They took everything from you," he said, his own voice thick with an anger that was fiercely on my behalf. "Your name, your mother, your entire history, your inheritance. It's monstrous. It's the most evil thing I've ever heard." His unwavering support was the one solid thing in my collapsing world. He helped me see past the emotional chaos to the cold, hard facts. "They didn't just lie to you, Emma," he said later that night, when my sobs had finally subsided to exhausted, shuddering breaths. "They erased your mother and stole your life for money. That's not something you can forgive." He was right. This wasn't something we could talk through in family therapy. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a violation of the deepest, most fundamental kind, and it demanded more than just a tearful apology. It demanded a reckoning. Armed with the devastating, world-altering truth, I felt a strange and terrible calm settle over me in the days that followed. The hurt was still there, a deep, resonant ache that I knew would take years to heal, but the confusion was gone, burned away by the fire of my newfound rage. It was replaced by an icy, diamond-hard clarity. I was no longer Emma, the dutiful, people-pleasing daughter, trying desperately to win the approval of parents who would never and could never truly love her for who she was. I knew who I was now. I was Sarah, and I was coming to collect what was mine. I called my parents me aunt and uncle and told them I was coming over, that we needed to talk. My voice was so cold and devoid of its usual warmth that they agreed without argument, a flicker of fear in their voices. I asked Mark to come with me, not to speak, but to be a silent witness, a grounding presence. When we walked into their pristine living room, the same room where they had performed their heart-wrenching grief over the miscarriage story, I felt absolutely nothing. No nostalgia, no sadness, no sense of loss. It was simply the set of a play I was no longer a part of. They were sitting together on their expensive white sofa, looking nervous and pale, clearly ready with another round of denials, excuses, and manipulations. I didn't give them the chance to launch their attack. I stood before them, Mark, a steady, immovable presence by my side, and I let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment, watching them squirm. Then, I spoke. "Hello," I said, my voice as cold and clear as glass. "My name is Sarah." The effect was immediate and devastating. It was as if I had thrown a grenade into the center of their carefully curated world. All the color drained from my mother's Susan's face, leaving it a waxy, horrified mask. My father David actually flinched, a physical recoil as if I had struck him. I watched their perfect, fraudulent world crumble in that single, shattering moment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply laid out the truth, piece by piece, like a prosecutor presenting an airtight case to a jury. I told them about Amelia, my real mother. I told them about her preventable death. I told them about the cover-up, the falsified documents, and the real reason for it all, the morality clause in my grandparents' trust. With every single sentence, they seemed to shrink, their blustering defenses and tearful protestations dying on their lips before they could even form. There was nowhere left for them to hide. Their attempts to fight back were pathetic, the dying twitches of a corrupt regime. David, summoning the last vestiges of his blustering paternal authority, started to stand, puffing out his chest. "Now you listen here, young lady," he began, his voice a low growl. But I cut him off with a look so cold, so filled with righteous fury, that it stopped him in his tracks. He sank back onto the sofa. "No," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You listen. For 28 years I have listened to your lies, your manipulations, and your self-serving narratives. Now, for the first time in my life, you are going to listen to me." Susan, as predicted, immediately resorted to tears, the default weapon in her emotional arsenal. "We did it to protect you," she sobbed, her voice a theatrical wail. "We didn't want you to grow up with that stigma. We loved you. We gave you a good life." The lie was so audacious, so utterly shameless, it was almost laughable. "A good life?" I repeated, my voice dripping with a scorn I didn't know I possessed. "You let my mother die and then you erased her from existence. You denied me my name, my history, my entire identity. You didn't do it to protect me. You did it for money. You have been living off my inheritance, my mother's legacy, my entire life." My gaze then shifted to Leo, who had been sitting in a wingback chair in the corner, silent and pale, for the entire confrontation. "And you," I said, my voice like ice, "the golden child, the lifestyle influencer. How much of your brave entrepreneurial spirit was paid for by the ghost of the aunt you were never allowed to mention? You knew, didn't you? You knew I wasn't your real sister." He stared at the floor, unable to answer, the smug, entitled smirk finally wiped from his face for good. He was a king whose castle had just been revealed to be made of sand and lies. The power dynamic in the room, a dynamic that had governed my entire existence, had been permanently and irrevocably rewired. For 28 years, they had held all the cards, manipulating my emotions, my sense of duty, and my deep-seated need for their approval. But the truth was, a trump card I never knew I had, and I had just played it. They had nothing left. No lies, no tears, no anger could stand against the simple, brutal weight of what they had done. They were exposed, not just to me, but to themselves. And in their eyes I saw the dawning, terrifying realization that their perfect, comfortable life was over. The silence that followed my accusation was the heaviest thing I had ever experienced. It was thick with the weight of their guilt, their shame, and the terrifying realization that their world had ended. They just stared at me, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. I was no longer their emotional puppet, their compliant daughter. I was a stranger in their house, a ghost from a past they had tried so desperately and cruelly to bury. In that moment of absolute, unprecedented control, I laid out the terms of my new reality, my declaration of independence. "This is the last time you will see me," I said, my voice unwavering, each word a carefully placed stone building a new wall between us. "I am not Emma Miller. I never was. I am Sarah, and I am taking my name and my life back. You will not call me. You will not text me. You will not try to contact me through friends or any remaining relatives. We are done." Susan let out a strangled sob, a desperate, guttural sound, and reached a trembling hand out to me across the chasm that now separated us. "Please don't do this," she begged. "We're your family." The word family was so obscene coming from her lips that I almost laughed out loud. "You stopped being my family the moment you decided my mother's memory was less important than a clause in a will," I retorted, my voice sharp and final. "You stopped being my family when you decided my life was a commodity to be traded for financial security." I then delivered the final blow, the one that moved this from a personal betrayal to a legal reality. "I will be seeking legal counsel to understand the full extent of the financial fraud you have committed against me since my birth. I will be petitioning the court to have my identity legally restored to Sarah. And I will be taking back every single cent you stole from me, and from her." I let that sink in, watching the fear in their eyes morph into a new, more practical and visceral terror. It wasn't just about losing me anymore, it was about losing everything: their home, their status, their comfortable life built on my stolen legacy. I turned and walked toward the door, Mark right behind me, his hand a supportive presence on my back. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. As I stepped out of that house and into the fresh, cool air of the evening, I didn't feel the grief or sadness I had anticipated. I felt a profound, exhilarating, impossible lightness. It was the feeling of a heavy, invisible chain, decades in the making, finally shattering into a million pieces. It was the feeling of freedom. The days that followed were a surreal whirlwind of legal consultations and painful, infuriating discoveries. I found a lawyer through a recommendation from a colleague, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s named Miss Albright, who specialized in complex estate fraud. I sat in her sterile, intimidatingly professional conference room and laid out the whole sordid story, my voice shaking at first but growing stronger and more resolute with every detail I recounted. She listened intently, her face impassive, taking meticulous notes. When I finished, she didn't offer pity or condolences. She looked at me with a fierce, determined anger in her eyes. "What they did," she said, her voice steely and precise, "is not just morally reprehensible, it's a felony. Several, in fact. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy. The list is long. The legal battle that ensued was long, ugly, and emotionally draining. My grandparents, the architects of the lie, along with David and Susan, lawyered up immediately, hiring a team of expensive, ruthless attorneys from a top city firm. They used the very money that should have been mine to fight me at every turn. They filed motion after motion, trying to paint me as an unstable, greedy opportunist who had been manipulated by a disgruntled, alcoholic uncle. They claimed Uncle Rick was trying to extort the family, and that my Aunt Carol was a battered wife being coerced into lying. It was a vicious, calculated smear campaign designed to break me down, to make me doubt myself and my allies. But every lie they told, every baseless accusation they hurled, only strengthened my resolve. We had to prove my parentage beyond any doubt, which meant petitioning a judge to exhume my mother Amelia's body for a DNA sample. It was a gruesome, heartbreaking process, having to disturb her final resting place, but it was necessary. Ms. Albright, a bulldog in the courtroom, methodically unearthed a mountain of damning evidence. The trail of the forged birth certificate, the suspicious timing of their cross-country move just after Amelia's death, financial records showing how my grandparents' money had flowed directly into David and Susan's accounts in the years following my birth. The most powerful evidence, however, came from Uncle Rick and Aunt Carol. Despite immense pressure, threats, and being completely cut off from the rest of the family, they held firm. On the witness stand, my uncle, sober and resolute, told the entire story, his voice cracking with a guilt that was palpable to everyone in the courtroom. He confessed his part in keeping the secret for all those years and laid the blame squarely on my grandparents' greed and my parents' complicity. The legal system moves at a glacial pace, but it grinds forward relentlessly. And with every document filed and every testimony given, the truth was being etched into the official record, overwriting the lie I had lived for so long. While the lawyers fought over motions and depositions, I embarked on a different, more personal kind of discovery. The legal battle was for justice, but my private journey was about reclamation. Aunt Carol, now completely free from my family's suffocating influence, became my guide to the past I never had. One afternoon, she came over to my apartment, her hands clutching a dusty, battered cardboard box tied with old twine. "I saved this," she said, her eyes welling with tears as she placed it on my coffee table. "I hid it in my attic for almost 30 years. I never knew if I'd be able to give it to you." It was Amelia's. The box was a time capsule, a treasure chest of a life that had been stolen from me. Inside, it smelled of old paper and dried flowers. There were my real mother's journals, their pages filled with her loopy, artistic handwriting and poignant, heartfelt entries. There were sketchbooks filled with breathtaking charcoal drawings of faces, landscapes, and hands. There were letters from friends, a pressed faded gardenia from her high school prom, a worn copy of On the Road. For the first time, Amelia stopped being a tragic, abstract figure in a story of betrayal and became a real, vibrant, living person. I saw photos of her for the first time, a beautiful young woman with a rebellious, joyful smile and the exact same almond-shaped eyes as me. I stayed up all night, reading her words, her dreams of being an artist in New York, her frustrations with our rigid, controlling family, her fears and hopes about her unborn baby about me. She wrote about her decision to name me Sarah, a name that meant princess, because in a world that made her feel worthless, she wanted me to know that I was loved and wanted, her precious girl. One crisp autumn weekend, I drove by myself to the small, neglected cemetery where she was buried under a simple, cold stone that read, "Amelia Miller, beloved daughter." They hadn't even given her the dignity of being a mother on her own gravestone. I sat on the grass beside her for hours, reading her journal out loud, telling her about my life, introducing myself properly. "Hi, Mom," I whispered to the wind. "It's me. It's Sarah." It wasn't a sad moment, it was a reunion. In that quiet cemetery, surrounded by the ghosts of my family's lies, I was finally, truly, meeting my mother. After 18 long, grueling months of legal warfare, the judge's ruling came down. Ms. Albright called me the moment the verdict was in. "We won," she said, and for the first time I heard a crack of pure emotion in her professional voice. "We won on every single count. It was a complete and total victory." The DNA evidence, of course, had been irrefutable. The court legally recognized me as Sarah Amelia, the sole surviving heir of Amelia Miller. The judgment nullified the fraudulent birth certificate my parents had used and declared me the rightful and sole beneficiary of my portion of the vast family trust. The financial settlement was staggering, far more than I could have ever imagined. It included not just the principal of the original inheritance, but 30 years of accrued interest, plus significant punitive damages for the decades of fraud and emotional distress. Overnight, I was wealthy beyond my wildest dreams, but the money, as massive as it was, felt secondary. The real victory was the truth, finally made public and undeniable. The court's decision was a public record, a permanent, indelible stain on my family's precious, carefully guarded reputation. My grandparents, David and Susan, were exposed for what they were: liars, thieves, and conspirators. The carefully constructed image of the perfect, wealthy, philanthropic family they had cultivated for decades was shattered into a million pieces. The fallout was immense and catastrophic for them. My grandparents became social recluses, their names synonymous with scandal in their small, wealthy community. David and Susan had to sell their large, beautiful house to pay their astronomical legal fees and the damages owed to me. Leo, the golden child, stripped of his endless funding, had to get a real 9-to-5 job for the first time in his life, his influencer career imploding overnight. The empire built on lies had crumbled into dust. Friends who had once praised my parents for their generosity and kindness now saw them for the monsters they truly were. The vindication was not in their ruin, though I admit a part of me felt a grim satisfaction. The true vindication was in the simple, powerful act of the truth being brought out of the darkness and into the light. I had not destroyed my family, I had merely held up a mirror, and they had been utterly destroyed by their own hideous reflection. It's been a year since the final court date, a year since the end of my old life and the beginning of my real one. Mark me husband No and I are sitting on the wide wraparound porch of our new home, a quiet, beautiful place in the country that we bought with cash, my mother's legacy. I legally changed my name a few months ago. I am Sarah Amelia. It felt strange at first, like wearing shoes that weren't quite broken in yet, but now it fits perfectly. Every time I see it written down, every time someone says it, it feels like coming home to a place I've never been. The white-hot anger has mostly faded, replaced by a profound, quiet sense of peace that I never knew was possible. The constant low-grade hum of anxiety that had been the background music of my entire life is finally gone. I am no longer waiting for the next phone call, the next manufactured crisis, the next subtle manipulation. My life, for the first time, is finally and completely my own. I have a new family now, one I chose. Mark, my wonderful, steadfast and loving husband. My Aunt Carol and Uncle Rick, with whom I'm slowly and carefully building a fragile but honest relationship, free from the toxicity of the past. And the memory of my mother, Amelia, who I get to know better every single day through her art and her words. I've established a scholarship for young female artists in her name at the local art school. I am creating a life that she would have been proud of, a life built on truth and love, not on secrets and transactions. They always say that blood is thicker than water, but I learned that truth is thicker, stronger, and more enduring than both. It took losing the family I thought I had to finally find myself, to excavate my own history, and find Sarah buried underneath all the lies. So now I put it to you, the person who has heard my story from beginning to end. In walking away completely, in taking back my name and my inheritance, and in exposing the truth that led to their ruin, did I go too far or not far enough?